Hi, I'm Royce with Agger Grand, and I'm going to review a soil analysis. This was a natural mineral soil sent in to us, and it has a cation exchange capacity of 15.73. So that means we would call this a moderately heavy soil, and by that it can hold a moderate amount of nutrients. We're looking here, the pH is 6.16, and this one is going to be fairly low. The ideal would be something close to 6.4 or 6.5. However, it's better to be low on the pH than high because it's easier to correct. If you look at the different elements here, we have ideal ratios that we're shooting for. We have here the negatively charged macronutrients. These are the phosphorus and the sulfur. And we have the ideal ratios, and then we have the difference from the ideal. And it looks like we're at 66% of the ideal level for phosphorus on this test. So my recommendation would be to add more, and we're going to check out exactly how much to add in just a minute here. With sulfur, it was not measured on the test. However, we can get sulfur a number of different ways, and we're definitely going to pick up some sulfur from my recommendation. That's also coming up. Here are the positively charged macronutrients, and the largest of which is calcium here. And this measured saturation on our test is 66.43%. And the ideal is close to 68%. So we are right there. We are 98% of the ideal level. So I would say perfect calcium. You don't have to add any more. Next on our list is magnesium. And right now, we're at a 14.4% saturation here. We'd like to be somewhere close to 12. However, between 10 and 20 would be an acceptable level. Having 12 as a perfect level would be better. We're at 1.2 times the amount of magnesium that would be needed for this soil. And so we would say that magnesium is a little high, and it could cause a slightly higher soil pH in the future. But we're not going to worry about it right now. We're not going to try and remove that, and we just have to keep in mind not to add anything that has a very high level of magnesium to the soil. The next thing here, and probably the most striking, is that our saturation of potassium is only at just under 1%, and we'd like it to be somewhere close to 7%. Anywhere from 6 to 8% would be ideal. And so my recommendation is to add more potassium. I'm going to recommend potassium sulfate as a really cheap, really good source that's also really clean. By clean, I mean it doesn't come along with any other nutrients or heavy metals or anything like that. And great news here, when we look at the percentage of hydrogen on this test, it's 12.6, and between 10 and 15% is perfect. So we have lots of hydrogen in the soil, and that means that we have a lot of room to add more nutrients. So that's perfect. Now we get to the micronutrients. Here's the positively charged ones. We're looking here at iron, manganese, copper, and zinc. And we're just about perfect on iron. We are 99% of the ideal level. Manganese is very low, however. We're just about 10% of ideal manganese. And so I'm going to recommend adding manganese sulfate to the soil. We'll look at how much in just a few minutes here. We're low on copper. We're at about 15% of the ideal level. And we're perfect on zinc, so we don't have to add any more of that. The negatively charged micronutrients, boron, chlorine, and silicon. The only one that we are actually looking at here that we have measured is boron. That's the most important one here. And we're at 67% of the ideal level. And so we are going to try to add some boron here, and that's going to be in the form of sodium borate. I'm going to switch to the next page that has the recommendations on here. And you can see in the top left, I'm going to recommend monopotassium phosphate. And so that's going to get us our phosphorus into the soil to raise that level up. And it also comes along with some potassium, which we also needed. So that's why I had selected this one. And here's 3 different recommendations just for different types of situations. If you're amending a whole acre of soil and it's natural, just dirt from the field, we're looking at 337 pounds of monopotassium phosphate per acre. If you're just working at a smaller garden instance, maybe it's like a 10-foot by 10-foot garden, that would be 100 square feet of just natural soil, that is field soil. We're looking at 0.77 pounds of monopotassium phosphate to get to the ideal level of phosphorus. I also added a recommendation if you're working with a potted mix, if you're putting this in containers. I like to go per cubic foot. That's about 7.5 gallons of media. Consider an overfull bucket of media. And if you have one of those, this is in milligrams. This is 332.8 milligrams. So consider it to be 1/3 of a gram of potassium sulfate per pot if you have like a large pot. Potassium sulfate is the other one that's really going to help us bring our potassium levels up. That is going to help so much with the structure of our plants. The stalks of the plants will be a lot stronger and they're going to have more sugar content because of this. And we are going to need actually a whole bunch of it if we're amending a whole acre. In natural soil, an acre would take 2,330 pounds of this potassium sulfate. If we're working in a small garden situation, a 100 square foot garden, that's 5.35 pounds of it. Or if we're in pots, we're at, so this is in milligrams still. If it's a large overfilled pot of organic media, potting mix, we're looking at 2,300 milligrams, which is 2.3 grams. Now to the micronutrients. We have 3 recommendations here. Manganese sulfate, we're looking at pounds per acre, 876 pounds of manganese sulfate, which is 31.5% by weight. Pure elemental manganese. If you're working in a natural soil, that's 100 square foot, just a garden plot, looking at 2 pounds of that. And if you're in just a potting mix or containerized soils, then we're going to look at 866 milligrams, or just under 1 gram. Copper sulfate, very similar types of recommendations here. If we're on the field, natural soil, per acre, 169 pounds of copper sulfate to fully amend that acre. Similar for the garden situation, 100 square feet, we're at 0.39 pounds to amend that area. And if you're in a containerized situation or just organic media, per cubic foot, we're looking at 166 milligrams. Sodium borate. Now the boron's very important to get calcium into the plant, so we definitely want to make sure we have enough there. It is totally a micronutrient. This is a very, very micronutrient because it's needed in such small quantities. For an acre, we would only need 3.67 pounds of this stuff. In the small garden situation, 100 square feet, this is 0.008 pounds. I would go ahead and convert that into a grams figure so that you could more easily apply that to the garden. If you're working in organic media, we're only looking at 3.63 milligrams per cubic foot. As far as applying the manganese, copper, and sodium borate, I would mix those up into water so I can spray them onto the surface of the soil and then possibly work them in or just leave them on the surface. You could apply them together, and I would also recommend using something like a fulvic acid in that mix to help them bind to those fulvic acid particles and get down into the soil and down into the roots of the plant quicker. When you're applying the monopotassium phosphate and potassium sulfate, you can feel free to just spread these on the surface and work them into the top few inches of soil. And since we actually have a pretty large addition of the potassium sulfate and the manganese sulfate, I would go ahead and amend maybe half of this amount for each different amendment. Maybe say amend half of it in the fall and then another half the following spring, kind of stagger them so that it doesn't shock those microbes in the soil. So that's the recommendation set here. And if you're interested in getting your own soil looked at like this, check out aggergrand.com. and you can go ahead and purchase some of our consultation tools. We can help you get the soil test done, or if you already have one, you could just buy a consultation there. And I'd be happy to review your soil and tell you what I think about it.